Mr. Topple and the Egg. Mr. Topple lived next door to Mr. Plod, the policeman. Mr. Topple was a brownie, and a very nice fellow too, always ready to help anyone he could. One day his Aunt Jemima was coming to tea, and he wanted to make a little cake for her. So he got everything ready, and then, oh dear, he found that the egg in his larder was bad. "I must have an egg for my cake," said Mr. Topple to himself. "I wonder if Mr. Plod, the policeman, would sell me one. I'll ask him." Mr. Plod kept hens in his garden, and they laid very nice eggs. Mr. Topple went to ask him, but he was out. Still, Mr. Topple knew where he would be. He would be at Busy Corner, directing the traffic there. So off he ran to Busy Corner and told Mr. Plod what he wanted. The big policeman nodded his head. "Of course you can have an egg from my hens. Run back, look in the hen house, and take the biggest and brownest you see there." So Mr. Topple went back home. He climbed over the wall and jumped down into Mr. Plod's garden. He went to the hen house and looked round, saw one big brown egg in a nesting box there, and came out with it in his hand. He climbed back over the wall again, and went indoors to make his cake. He made a lovely one, and cut a big slice out of it to send to Mr. Plod for his tea. Now, as Mr. Topple was climbing over the wall to get into Mr. Plod's garden, little Mrs. Whisper was passing by. She saw him jump down, and she watched him go into the hen house. She saw Topple come out with an egg in his hand, and jump back down over the wall into his own garden again. "Well," said Mrs. Whisper, "well, the nasty horrid thief. He knows Mr. Plod is down at Busy Corner, and so he thought he would get over and steal an egg. Well." Mrs. Whisper hurried on, and soon she met Mr. Talky. "Good morning, Mr. Talky," she said. "Do you know what I've just seen the most dreadful thing. I saw Mr. Topple creeping into Mr. Plod's hen house and stealing an egg. I saw it with my own eyes. What do you think of that?" "What a thing to do," said Mr. Talky, shocked. I'm surprised at Mr. Topple, really. I am. Dear, dear, dear. And he seems such a nice fellow, too." Mr. Talky went on his way. Soon he met Miss Simple, and he stopped to speak to her. After a bit he said, "Do you know, I've just heard a most dreadful thing. I met Mrs. Whisper, and she told me that she saw Mr. Topple creeping into Mr. Plod's hen house today and stealing an egg." "Well, well, would you believe it?" said Miss Simple, her eyes wide open in surprise. "You wouldn't think Mr. Topple would do such a thing, would you?" Miss Simple hurried on her way, longing to tell somebody about Mr. Topple. What a bit of news! Fancy Mr. Topple daring to steal an egg from the village policeman. Miss Simple met Dame Listen. "Dame Listen," she said at once, "I've just heard such a bit of news. Mr. Topple, you know that nice Mr. Topple, the brownie, don't you? Well, do you know, he's been stealing eggs out of Mr. Plod's hen house. What do you think of that?" "Shocking," said Miss Listen. "Really shocking. Something ought to be done about it." She went away and soon met Mr. Meddle. She told him the news. "Mr. Meddle, would you believe it, that brownie Mr. Topple is a thief. He steals eggs. Fancy that. He was seen creeping into somebody's hen house stealing eggs. He's a thief. He ought to be in prison." So he ought, said Mr. Meddle, banging his stick on the ground. "And what's more, I shall complain about this to Mr. Plod, the policeman. Why, none of our eggs, or our hens either, will be safe if Mr. Topple starts stealing. There's Mr. Plod over there, Busy Corner. I'll go and tell him now." So Mr. Meddle, feeling very busy and important, went over to Mr. Plod. "Mr. Plod," he said, "I have a complaint to make, and I expect you to look into it. I hear that Mr. Topple is a thief. I think he ought to be in prison." Mr. Plod was so surprised to hear this that he waved 2 lorries on at the same moment, and there was very nearly an accident. He stared in astonishment at Mr. Meddle. "Mr. Topple a thief?" he said. "Nonsense. I've lived next door to him for years, and a kinder, more honest fellow I never met. Who says he's a thief? And what does he steal?" "Miss Listen told me," said Mr. Meddle. "She said he steals eggs." Mr. Plod left Busy Corner, and taking Mr. Meadow with him, walked off to find Miss Listen. "What's all this about Topple stealing eggs?" he said. "Oh," said Miss Listen, "well, Miss Simple told me. You better ask her where she got the dreadful news from. There she is in the baker's." Mr. Plod called Miss Simple. "What's all this about Topple stealing eggs?" he said. "Well, I heard it from Mr. Talky," said Mrs. Simple. "He told me all about it. Dreadful, isn't it?" "Come along," said Mr. Plod to Mr. Meadow, Dame Listen, and Sally Simple. "We'll all go to find Mr. Talky. I'm going to get to the bottom of this." They found Mr. Talky at home. "What's all this about Topple stealing eggs?" said Mr. Plod, beginning to look rather stern. "Isn't it a shocking thing?" said Mr. Talky. "I've told ever so many people, and they were all surprised. It was Miss Whisper that told me. Miss Whisper lived across the road. Mr. Plod took them all to her house and banged on her door. She opened it and looked surprised to see so many people outside. "What's all this about Topple stealing eggs?" said Mr. Plod. "Oh, have you heard about it?" said Mrs. Whisper. "Well, I saw him take the egg. Saw it with my own eyes." "When and where?" asked Mr. Plod, taking out his notebook. "This very morning," said Mrs. Whisper. "I was passing your back garden, Mr. Plod, and I happened to look over the wall, and what did I see but Mr. Topple going into your hen house and coming out with one of your eggs in his hand, and then he jumped back over the wall again. What do you think of that? I think he ought to be in prison." Mr. Plod shut his notebook with a snap. He looked round so sternly that everyone began to feel afraid. "This morning," said Mr. Plod in a loud and angry voice, "this morning my friend Mr. Topple came to me at Busy Corner and said his aunt was coming to tea, and he was making her a cake, and as his egg was bad, could he have one of mine?" There was silence. No one dared to say anything. Mr. Plod went on. "I said of course he could, and so I suppose he went back and got the egg. And now, all around the town, there are people saying that Topple is a thief, a kind, honest fellow like Topple." "I'm sorry I said such a thing," began Mr. Talky, "but I believed Miss Whisper when she told me." "Don't make excuses," said Mr. Plod in a thundery sort of voice. "It's all of you who ought to be in prison, not poor Mr. Topple. How dare you say a man is a thief, Miss Whisper, when you don't know at all whether he is or not? How dare you, Mr. Talky, and all you others too, to repeat this wicked story, when you don't know at all whether it is true or not?" Miss Simple began to cry. "Now, one more word of this kind from any of you, and I'll be after you," said Mr. Plod. "You will all go round and tell everyone that you've made a sad mistake, and are ashamed of yourselves. Go now, for I've a very good mind to put you all into prison." Miss Simple gave a scream and ran away. The others ran too, because Mr. Plod looked so stern. "I just won't have people taking somebody's good name away," said the policeman. And he stamped back to Busy Corner. "I just won't. It's as wicked a thing as stealing." Well, so it is, isn't it? I think Miss Whisper and the others will be very careful in future, don't you?